activator, futuristic, maximizer, positivity, and input. I'm Shane Metcalf, and I'm the co founder of 15.5, though I just recently stepped out of my role as an operator in the company and have continued to build my own executive coaching practice. My biggest aha moment around learning my strengths was that strengths are actually just themes that you need to invest in. But because they're in your top themes, there's a nearly unlimited ceiling of growth to how far you can develop these. And I always think you can turn them not only into strengths, but your superpowers.
I'm Darren Verasami,
I'm Brandon Miller,
and this is the Strengths Whisperer.
the show empowering leaders to create, build, and sustain great places to work.
On this episode, we have Shane Metcalf, the co-founder and former chief people officer of 15.5 on the show. Shane, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Darren, great to be here. I'm really excited to continue to dive into the contemplation of strengths and how do we leverage our strengths for maximum effect in the world and on our purpose.
Absolutely. Shane and I actually had the privilege of working together. Shane, you were employee number 3 at 15.5, and today 15.5 is nearly 300 employees. Your journey there has been quite remarkable, but I remember in the early days, probably about 8 or 9 years ago, I came in and I did a strength session with your team. There was maybe 9 employees total. And I know that was a brand new experience for 15.5 at the time, going through strengths, and your journey evolved from employee number 3 to being a co-founder to then moving into the ranks of chief people officer. Can you tell us just a little bit about that story and how strengths played into that journey for you?
So it has been a wild ride, as all of our lives are, right? I would dare anybody to say that their life hasn't been a wild ride. Just to exist in the world today is a wild ride. But the journey of starting 15.5 and the hero's journey of a career, right? Where a career actually is this kind of catalyst for us becoming a better version of ourselves that challenges us, that forces us to grow in sometimes uncomfortable ways. And before I started 15.5, I had actually discovered coaching. And up until that point, I'd had a pretty weird, non-linear career path, right? A lot of trial and error, a lot of personal development, a lot of 1-2 year careers. And coaching, I discovered about 2 years prior. And coaching through the lens of strengths was the first thing that I discovered that had synthesized all of my different gifts and my strengths into a single offering. And I thought I was going to coach for the rest of my life. Little do I know, I end up having a tea with this guy, David Hassel. We start chatting. I share some of the things that I'm passionate about. And next thing you know, I'm on payroll with David, helping him launch 15.5. Again, through the lens of strengths, what I realized the journey of starting as an employee and then actually retroactively becoming a co-founder was that David had given me permission to use my strengths, to use the things that I had a natural affinity towards, the various tools, technologies, frameworks that I'd picked up. And he said, yes, please implement those in building the culture, building the company. Doing so made such an impact that David invited me to become a co-founder of 15.5. And so it was one of these journeys where I never sought out to build a company, to start a company, and yet it found me. And then over the last 11 years, it has been an incredible process and challenging and enlightening and deeply rewarding, right? All of it boils down to a deeply rewarding journey of building and scaling a company that's been able to have impact on hundreds of thousands of people.
And 15.5 is very much in the engagement and retention space, right? Can you just share just quickly a little bit about what 15.5 actually does?
Yeah, 15.5 is a platform of products that allow companies to build highly engaged and high performing teams through a human centric lens. And so if you think about a lot of the performance management systems, a lot of the paradigms that we have around how do you manage people, how do you measure engagement, how do you improve performance, most of those paradigms and then the resulting tools and processes that emerge from that paradigm and that worldview came out of the industrial era, came out of manufacturing, came out of assembly line worker, and where Taylorism of saying, hey, let's treat everybody the same way and let's just increase efficiency. And essentially, what you're doing in that model is you're stripping away the uniqueness and the humanity of the people inside of the company in order to gain efficiency. And that can work in certain business models and in certain decades, let's say, but it is an incredibly outdated approach to inspiring humans and getting the most out of them. And so you can think of 15.5 as an approach to building great cultures, to achieving high performance, to achieving business success, but rooted in modern understanding of how human beings actually are motivated and what inspires them to do great work. And so that's the entire platform. And so there's engagement surveys, performance reviews, manager tools, one on ones, check ins, recognition programs, goal setting, OKR software, manager training. Like we launched a program called Transform 2 years ago that's really all about helping companies up level their managers because managers are a leverage point, right? It doesn't really matter if you're keyed into your strengths. If your manager doesn't really know what your strengths are and isn't leading from that place, it can quickly derail a very positive career experience into a negative one. And so that's where so much leverage is in the managers. And we're focusing a lot on that, building tools for managers and the partnership between HR and managers. That is one of the highest leverage things that any company can do is build a strategic partnership between HR and the rest of management.
That's very, very important. And when we tie that back into strengths and the historical perspective that you just did an incredible job of just overlaying here, the shift that we're actually amidst now, because many of the techniques and the way that we're managing, practicing leadership is very dated in the way that things have been done. And a strengths based approach to that form of work and the people side of the business is a newer approach, but it's a very, very necessary one. One thing that I love that you said about your own personal journey, Shane, that when you went from employee to co-founder and then on to chief people officer and growing and scaling 15.5 was David Hassel, one of the founders of 15.5, gave you permission to play to your strengths and to really use them. Can you share some of your strengths with our listeners and what did you feel that you truly had permission to step into in those early years as you were growing and scaling the company and truly growing into your best self? What were some of your strengths that were really at play there that you really discovered and that you were able to utilize?
So back in the day, my top five were activator, maximizer, relator, communication, futuristic. And for the most part, like I'm in the same ballpark now. So activator, maximizer, relator, communication, futuristic. A lot of what I was doing in those early days of 15.5 that David gave me the permission to, and that I'd already picked up some of the tools and capacity to create was taking people from a superficial level of relating to a very deep, authentic, and vulnerable level of connection and communication. I remember we were sitting around the table one day in Tahoe at a company retreat when there was just four of us. David Hassel, Nazar Ivaniv, our CTO and technical co-founder, Christian Sobolski, our first engineer, and myself. And then Stacy Hurst was also in the background
Right.
working with David as his personal assistant. And so she's really technically the first employee of 15.5, and then Christian, and then me. Around that table, I just did a table question. And table questions have become an integral part of the 15.5 culture as a social technology to take people into these deeper levels of connection. But I remember asking, okay, you guys want to do something? It's a little weird. And I remember being very nervous because it's an act of vulnerability to say, I have an idea. Will you guys all play my game? Always a risk of rejection and people not wanting to actually go there.
Mhm.
David said, yeah, sure, let's do it. And so I asked a couple of questions and we all went around and we each answered them. And I think it was like, what do you really want us to know about you? And then the next question was like, what do you not want us to know about you? At that question, you could just feel the energy shift, right? Everybody gets a little quieter, a little more scared, but also a little more courageous. And then we all went around. And that was a defining moment for the company because I think we all felt the greater sense of connection and of seeing who each other really are in the places that we've said, hey, I'm going to keep this part of my professional life walled off from the people that arguably I spend more time with than anybody else on the planet. And so It was using some of my gifts around weaving social connection, around creating that depth, around helping people feel seen and known for who they really are and who they're afraid people will see them as. The beautiful thing is when people actually reveal the thing that they're afraid of people seeing, all that happens is increases in trust, connection, and respect.
It's so interesting because vulnerability, if I'm hearing you right, Shane, a lot of times there's a stigma around that word that we'll hear within organizational culture, even in mainstream society. You can't be vulnerable, you can't show these areas. And yet, when we do that, it gives others permission to do the same. Hey, I'm not perfect, I've got my gaps. And here's the other part that we've seen from a strengths lens, it allows somebody else's gifts to pour in to our areas where we have gaps, right? So we call it this term, this whole notion through strengths of being confidently vulnerable, where you're confident in where you shine and where you're also confident in where you're blind. So you got to own your strengths and also own your gaps to really play to your gifts. Because when you're keenly aware of where you shine and where you're really strong, you also have to be keenly aware of where your gaps are. And that allows somebody else's gifts to really pour in to those areas. And together, we as a team, as an organization, as a family, as a group of friends, can go so much further than we could on our own. Is that a fair assessment of what you started with that uncomfortable act?
Yeah, I mean, I love that frame because it shows how only trying to look good and cover our ass, which can be a full-time job, actually not only robs us of being able to really leverage our strengths, but it also robs other people of the opportunity to contribute and it diminishes the whole system. When our primary concern is trying to look good, it really is a thief that steals our own genius.
I think what is really intriguing about some of the sessions that you talked about in your own strengths, that relator strength, you recently retook it as you've now moved on from 15.5, but you recently retook the assessment. And you said those strengths are still very much at play. That relator strength, as long as I've known you, which has been, gosh, nearly a decade now, I've always known our conversations to be rich and deep. And anytime that I'm with you, you're just highly present. And I've observed that with you time and time again. And that ability for that relator to just, when you're with somebody, to go deep and be willing to just invite others to come along. You'll go there. Sometimes you'll lead by taking that leap on your own, putting yourself out there, and then getting others to come alongside of you. And I think that has been a fascinating way to see your relator play out over the years and in your leadership style as you've grown from, again, from a very small team to growing a whole organization. One thing for our listeners that I think is fascinating is your maximizer was in the top 5. And we've talked about this particular.
It still is, right?
Exactly. It still is. It's number 3 right now. Yeah, it was in your top 5 then, and it still showed up at number 3 this time. And what I wanted to say was I vividly remember some of the ahas that we had when we were doing that team session years ago, because many on the team, I think it was 7 or 9 people at the time, had Maximizer. You had it, David Misna had it, there was a few others. And then David Hassel, the CEO of 15.5, was a top 5 restorative, I think was either his number 1 or number 2. Now, these two strengths, it's very common if you have one high, the other one is like 32 or 33, which we ended up finding out was the case because maximizers see a situation, they see what's strong, and they want to develop the areas of strength and take good to great, great to excellent. Restorative is strength that naturally looks at the same situation, sees where the breaks are. What are the problems? What needs fixing to restore something to what it could be? So what ends up happening sometimes when these two strengths work together is a restorative might come to the table and they start off by leading with problem identification with then the desire to move to solution. And sometimes maximizers can hear that through the lens of, why are you focusing on the negatives? Why are we focusing on the negatives constantly? And conversely, restorative will hear that maximizer strength say, why are you only focusing on what's good and what's strong? We got to deal with these problems and going through. The ahas that I remember coming together when there was that realization that David had at the time, a CEO, of realizing that's how he comes to the table. And for all of you sitting in the room and realizing it was just a function of how we communicate, but actually everybody was after the same goal of making 15.5 the best that it could be, but we're looking at it from very different lenses. It transformed communication from that point forward. I remember follow-up conversations that we had, the conversation with David several months later after the fact, where he was talking about how just that awareness was huge for him. How was that for you?
It was interesting that I think a lot of David's top fives were all in my bottom,
Correct. Yeah. For a
in my
lot of the
30s.
team. Yeah. Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
And so I think, I mean, that revelation of just being like, yes, this is why we feel like we're such good partners, is that we complement each other. Right. I think it would have been a little disconcerting if me and David had the same strengths. It would have been like, well, okay, there's redundancy here. But with this diversity of strengths, we actually come to the table and are stronger together, and we can actually cover each other's blind spots. What was great about David, particularly, is that he never made anybody wrong for how they approached something. Prior to this revelation, it wasn't like, oh my God, we don't understand each other and why are you like this? But it was more of a confirmation of, yes, we really can leverage this. He can bring his restorative to the table,
Mm-hmm.
and then I can bring maximizer, and the rest of the team can bring maximizer, and we can have constructive conflict, right? When thinking about how do we build extraordinary cultures, I don't rely on just a single model, right? We're looking at strengths, and then we're also looking at, for instance, Lencioni's 5 dysfunctions of a team. And so, how do we use maximizer and restorative to create really good conflict where we can mine for what is true? What is the best idea? And to this day, right, there's always some tension of that restorative. Hey, let's look at all the things that can go wrong, and let's look at what is wrong, and let's face the hard facts. And then maximizer can also say, great, that can be all true, but it doesn't mean that we need to lose a deep sense of determination to win and to figure out the solution to this. And that is where we need to put our attention. Let's diagnose the problems, and that'll give us a better understanding of how to fix it.
Yeah, Shane, I want to say what you just brought forth is so important for listeners. And it's when we play to our strengths, it's not an elimination of conflict on the team. What it brings forward is healthy conflict. Conflict actually creates strength on teams, right? Lencioni, you talked about his work, and one of his analogies that he shares is baseball pitcher that's throwing constantly with one arm, right? The bone density on their throwing arm is somewhere like to 30 to 40% more dense than their non-throwing arm. And that's because over the years of stress, the little microfractures that take place, the time that they take in between the rest, they heal, and the areas where those microfractures heal are actually stronger. So sometimes there's this notion within culture and these types of skills of building employee engagement. It means that there's an environment where there's no conflict. That couldn't be further from the truth. Organizations that play to their strengths, organizations that have highly engaged employees where retention levels are high, know how to have conflict in a healthy way, and it doesn't become a problem because they understand it's not personal if you and I are having a healthy conversation and working to move an idea forward. It's not that it's a personal attack on you or you're creating a personal attack on me through a conflict standpoint. It's moving the best ideas forward that are in the greatest interest of the organization and doing that in a healthy way. That is playing to our strengths. That is what's going to create cultures of engagement and moving things forward. And speaking of challenges and conflict and growing and all those elements that come with it, Shane, again, we come back to the story of you started at 15.5. You were in the first 10 employees there, and you were able to see it through and take over the role as chief people officer, getting the company up to the size of nearly 300 employees that are scattered across the globe in a remote workforce environment predominantly. Can you speak a little bit about what that journey was like and what some of the challenges were like, and then what some of the successes were like in the journey?
Yeah, we've been remote since day one. And also, I'll just say that I'm no longer operating 15.5, and I stepped out in December of 2022. And I've now moved on to my next chapter, and I'm very happy about that. And again, just so much gratitude for that 11 years of strengths development, right? Of really putting myself through the crucible of business challenge to become who I am today. And I'm pretty happy with who I am and the journey of that, even though I think that there's ass kickings and getting your teeth knocked in is a whole always a part of that journey. But if we come from the lens of anti-fragility, right, of being anti-fragile, that it is the stressors, the micro fractures, and that's how we become strong, that we can view our careers, right? And that's just not even our careers, that's just life
It's just
polishing
life.
us.
It's just life. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that's baked in. Like, that's a part of the design is that challenge is how we activate our own genius. And that as much as we want to wish away the challenges in our life, we shouldn't, because it is the very fuel that propels us up the mountain. So a couple of things is that we were distributed from day one, right? We had people in Arizona, New York, San Francisco, and then we also hired our first engineer in Poland, and we built out a Ukrainian and Polish engineering team as well. We were doing remote and a more of, let's call it a more of a hybrid model from the beginning in 2012. And so we always knew that remote brought a lot of blessings with it, access to global talent, a much more of a advantage around talent and talent acquisition. But it also had some serious drawbacks, right? How do you create a depth of connection when you aren't in the same room? How do you create highly effective collaboration? And so again, we're going on the model of Lencioni of you need a foundation of trust in order to engage in positive conflict, which then allows you to commit and hold each other accountable, and then ultimately focus on results. That's the five dysfunctions model. And so we always knew that we needed a framework where we could create that same sense of emotional connection and alignment towards the mission. And ultimately, I think that some of the structures that we used that worked really well was that we did an annual company-wide retreat where we brought the whole company together in person for what I think of as transformational business retreats. And so it's not just an offsite. It's not like, hey, let's just get together, do business strategy, get drunk, and call it bonding. It was, hey, let's come together. Let's really understand what are the high leverage business conversations we can have that actually create a new future. How do we have a depth of social bonding so that we can emerge feeling closer and more trust, more seeing of each other? And then how do we also create personal development opportunities in the middle of that so that we emerge picking up tools and resources and experiences that actually leave us better off for the long term? And so weaving all of those things into the company retreats, I think it really made for a very dynamic and compelling experience for everybody that attended them. And then we would do quarterly leadership retreats. And generally, we ended up doing that biannually and then remotely biannual. So every other quarter, we'd get together as a leadership team in person, because I don't care who you are, there is an irreplaceable quality of in person collaboration that you can't actually recreate virtually. And I say that as somebody that is a big advocate of remote, but that is why in regular in person connections is essential. So you have that kind of a framework. So each department would get together once a year. But in between, we would create things like Question Friday, which is essentially table questions, like that first day in Tahoe, where somebody asks a question, everybody goes around and answers. And we created that as a virtual experience called Question Friday. And so every Friday, everybody would get on. It was optional. We had 100% of the company. And then as we scaled up, it was probably 20% of the company every Friday with a rotating cast of characters. And again, there would be somebody that would ask a question and a prompt, and then we would all go around and answer. And it seems kind of simple, but the power of it, of having people laugh, cry, celebrate, grieve together, was just profound. And I really do credit that those practices that we implemented are what allowed us to win Best Place to Work awards from a variety of different organizations, right? Almost every culture award in the book we won because of this approach of saying, we're going to take this hybrid approach. We're going to give a lot of freedom and flexibility to people, but then we're also going to make damn sure the people that are in this company have an interest in becoming a better version of themselves and investing in their peers and leaning into this culture of growth where you emerge from it better off than when you first started. That really is playing to the maximize our strength. How do we maximize the potential of every person? How do we unlock human potential at work? And that was always just a living experiment. And there's no greater benefit than a healthy culture with good managers. And then on top of that, you can layer in some of the edge pushing benefits that we've also provided over the years.
Absolutely. And that just ties in so much. Your focus has always been internally and through the work that 15.5 does with clients. But what your focus has always been, as I've known you, is helping people to become their best selves and realizing that that journey just never ends. You're constantly in that pursuit. And there's that focus in how do we unlock our genius and do the work that we're meant to do here. Shane, how does fulfillment play in to all of this? Because I know you're a huge focus in your life is make sure that you personally and those around you are finding fulfillment in whatever they're doing in life, not only in work, but how they're living.
Yeah. I think that that fulfillment is a seed that exists inside of the ground of dissatisfaction. And so I think that it's important to not just try to bypass our dissatisfaction and go into fulfillment because it is that agitation. It is feeling like there is something missing in our life or that we aren't fulfilled it is the catalyst for us to begin that journey that ultimately leads to fulfillment. And fulfillment is a verb, right?
Mhm.
Fulfillment isn't just a static state of being.
Mhm.
And that is, again, why I think that the work around strengths is really interesting because the research is pretty clear. When we use our strengths on a regular basis, we're more likely to have an experience of fulfillment. That is a very strong lever that we have to pull for creating deeper satisfaction and fulfillment. Just like strengths don't start off as strengths, right? They start off as themes and then we have to invest in them. We need to invest and think about what is a truly fulfilling life, right?
Mhm.
What are all of the dimensions of our life, right? Work and career is just one dimension. There's all of our personal relationships. There's our internal emotional reality. There's our intellectual life. There's our spiritual life. There's our financial life. There's our quality of life.
Mhm.
And we need to think integrally, holistically about who we are if we have a chance of actually creating an enduring fulfillment. And so that's where I think that work is a really interesting leverage point because it has such a huge impact on us, right? It's not the most important thing in our life, but it does take up a huge chunk of our time and attention and focus. And so if we can create cultures that kind of nudge people towards greater self awareness, unlocking their genius, doing things that interest us, that is going to have a massive impact on our lives. And so that's where the journey of working towards greater fulfillment can be one of not just for ourselves, but of creating cultures that move people along that heroine's journey of deeper fulfillment because we're actually doing the work that we're meant to be doing here. And look, it's a personal journey. And sometimes what feels like a wrong turn and doing a job that is deeply unsatisfying or working in a crappy culture is the very thing that actually inspires us to wake up and say, I do not want this. This is not what I want. And I am going to burn it all to the ground to pursue a life of greater meaning and greater fulfillment. Maybe we wouldn't have actually ever had that courage. We wouldn't have come to the drawing a line in the sand of, I do not want to live a compromised life if we didn't actually go through some of those crappy experiences. We can't say that the bad is actually bad because I think it's actually just part of the design of how humans actually grow. The whole kind of matrix that we live in is almost, unfortunately, at times designed to have us suffer, and that actually is the thing that leads to our blossoming.
It's so true what you say. Life sometimes happens for us, not to us. It's happening for us even when we don't love the journey or that particular portion of the journey. What you just highlighted, Shane, I regularly say this. I had the privilege of being a highly disengaged employee in a previous role that I had the privilege of working for a horrific manager because it lit in me a fire of realizing I can be on the sidelines and just kind of go through life checking somebody else's boxes, doing whatever and collecting a paycheck, or I can go out there and do something about it. Because I personally had read about things that's where it started, but ended up continuing down the path of developing myself and then connecting with people that could make workplaces different. So people didn't have to go home from work feeling like a baby treats a diaper. That's just not the way that people should feel like when they go home from work. People just want to be valued for being valuable. Now, interestingly enough, as we're getting close to wrapping up our time together, as you mentioned, you've made the transition out of 15.5. That takes a lot of courage, Shane, to go on the journey that you've gone through. Many people realize that they want to make a change and yet don't feel like they have the capacity to do it. And yet you've done that on a pretty massive scale, taking something that you've been an integral part of growing and being a part of that journey. And you were able to find inside of your soul that, hey, you know what? It's time for me to transition. Can you share a little bit about what that experience was like for you?
Yeah, it's always an interesting thing, right? Especially as a co-founder, I had a sense of obligation and duty of getting the company to an exit or to whatever the next milestone I'd had in my head that was different than what was happening. But ultimately, it was a very considered decision, right? It was probably 18 months, 2 years in the making of really thinking, like initially, like thought coming in and be like, no, no, I'm not even going to entertain that, to being like, wait, I think that there is something else that I'm actually wanting, and I'll give it a little more consideration. No, 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 no. I couldn't possibly do that. And so towards the end, it was really this deeper contemplation of thinking, okay, actually the company is in a great place. We've built out an amazing team that are frankly more competent than I am at this stage of the business. And maybe my sense of obligation is misinformed, that the company can be fine without me, that I have actually created a self-replicating culture of these values. Everything that I've been talking about still exists in the company without me. There's still this deeper leaning towards vulnerability. There's a proclivity for personal development and transformational work. And a lot of this is because of David's values and Nazar's values and the foundational values that really have built the company. And that I don't need to keep infusing energy into it because it's actually self replicating. I was in that contemplation and I was really feeling probably could go either way. And it was actually some close friends that helped push me over the edge by, again, believing in whatever I wanted to do next. But by saying, hey, we'll be there with you, we'll help, we believe in this next chapter, is really, again, people's belief in us and them seeing and encouraging. Never underestimate the power of believing in somebody. Never underestimate the power of being a friend who listens to the people around you and listens for what the deeper yearning and also what the deeper fears are, and then be present with them in that, and then ultimately advocate for almost the scarier path, but taking the path less traveled, taking those risks in our life. And it was really that friend that helped push me over the edge. And then it was some deeper conversations with the rest of my team and exploring this idea and how we could make it work. And so it was a very considered decision, but it was ultimately the right decision. And I'm excited to ultimately get back to my roots. And I'm coaching founders and CEOs now. And it's pretty fun because it is a full circle loop back to where I began as a coach. And with this kind of 11-year detour of building a company and my own journey and, who I am today and who I get to be as a coach is very different than who I was 11 years ago. And I'm incredibly grateful for that.
That is So powerful to hear. And it really does highlight the power of believing in somebody. One other thing that really comes out in that journey for me, Shane, is just sometimes our own brilliance and our own strengths, we can overlook how powerfully at play they actually are. And those that believe in us and those that see that in us might see areas that we overlook and just think, it's no big deal. And those strengths and that
because
genius
they
zone,
occur as
they
normal.
just
They
occur
occur
as
as normal
normal
to
as
us.
anybody could do that. It's a piece of cake. It's easy. And those friends and people that are willing to give us that very authentic feedback, sometimes it's the feedback that hurts a little bit and it stings a little bit, but it's the reality that we need, can show us how these things that we're overlooking and we're just seeing as it's just normal, it's just basic, that it actually isn't, that it's actually very unique. And there's a huge gift out there, and that we have the ability to light many other people's candles with it in going forward. So thank you so much for sharing that, because I think that is definitely a challenging area for many leaders. They get to a point and they just figure, well, I'm not being loyal. I should stick this out. And that might not actually be the right call. It might not even be in the best interest of the business that they actually love and they really care about. Thanks for sharing that journey, Shane. I really appreciate that. Now, I know you and I could talk forever, and we've had many a great conversation over the years, but it's hard to believe we're actually at time. I wanted to ask, if people want to get in touch with you or learn more about you, where can they go?
LinkedIn is the best place to find me. So Shane Metcalf on LinkedIn, and would be delighted to connect with anybody from any of that's listened to this. And Darren, I just also want to say thank you for being a huge piece of the journey in me actually really discovering my strengths, right? That workshop we did way back in the day was really foundational. And it's funny, as I've been going through some of the old office stuff, I've found all of our strengths cups
Yeah.
that we created with you guys, and where we made mugs for all of our employees with their top 5 strengths. And it's fun to think about how much strengths has really informed how we've taken the approach we've taken in building the company. So thanks for being a huge part of that.
Oh, truly my pleasure, Shane. I was honored when I had the opportunity to do that. And I was honored when you contacted us to do a little bit of a train the trainer for you guys so you could really take it deeper into culture. And it's been remarkable watching what you've done and what has been built over the years. So I just want to thank you so much, Shane, for joining us and sharing your story today of being truly what it means to be a people first leader here on the Strengths Whisperer. And for our listeners out there, I've got to ask, are you ready to discover your strengths to accelerate into life like Shane has? We believe in this path so much, we're offering our listeners the opportunity to discover their top 5 Clifton strengths. And all you have to do is email us at Brandon, Brandon, at 34strong.com with the subject line top 5 to request your top 5 strengths code. Shane, because you have just wrapped up your journey at 15.5, any final parting thoughts for other chief people officers, chief human resource officers, other leaders that are out there in the space that are learning to use their strengths like you have?
Well, I think that there's always a fear that if we use our strengths, then there's going to be work that goes undone. And that there maybe is a little bit of truth to that, right? Usually we have to do some work that we don't really enjoy, but it all starts with self awareness. Understand your strengths and then ask yourself every day, how can I bring these to the table? How can I do the work that I need to do through the lens of this strength? And then what's also interesting is, for anybody that isn't playing around with GPT yet, the whole AI chatbot,
Sure.
is that AI is in a way this kind of interesting leverage point that could, I think, actually really help us unlock our strengths. And yeah, there's a whole lot of really interesting questions and considerations, but the world is rapidly changing, and AI does have the possibility to help us leverage our strengths and take over our weaknesses in some really fascinating and unexplored ways.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you more, man. It really is pretty powerful what's out there.
I mean, like, just go ask GPT, hey, how do I use my activator strength
Exactly.
to achieve more professional success?
Very, very much.
Sorry for opening up a whole can of worms right there at the end, but I just think that if anybody isn't really observing this, it's going to change the world in ways that we can't even imagine in a shorter amount of time than any of us expect.
Completely. I completely agree with you on that. Shane, thank you so much for your time and for joining us today on the Strengths Whisperer. Listeners, just remember, if you'd like to have your top 5, just reach out to us at brandon@34strong.com and share your thoughts on today's episode. Thanks so much for tuning in to the Strengths Whisperer. We'll see you real soon.